Hi everybody, this is Ajudhia from AKLO series. So today we'll be talking about a Transfer of Property Act 1882. The video is going to be a little different from what we did previously. So we will be covering Unit 1 of second semester LLB course in KSLU syllabus. So this is more like exam focused, and we will try to highlight or cover those key principles or key doctrines in Unit 1, and let's see how it goes. So let's go to the. So before we dwell deeper into the various doctrines or principles which is kind of covered in the unit, we will try to understand what is a transfer of property. So if you look at Section 5 of Transfer of Property Act 1882, it clearly defines what exactly it means, or rather what does TPA do, right? So TPA technically means an act between two living persons whereby they are conveying property from one person to another. It can be either in the present or in the future. So in a nutshell, if you see, this is all the definition is about. So it says, so let's go to the essentials to understand a little further. So it says it has to be inter vivos. Inter vivos in the sense it has to be between living persons only. So when I say living persons, it cannot be a living person or a person X who has property is transferring to person Y who is a dead person. It cannot happen that way. Both the persons, both the parties have to be existing at that point of time. So that is condition number one. Second is, why are they using living persons? Why they're not using human beings, right? Living persons can also mean, also takes into consideration the artificial person created by the law. So when I say artificial person, I'm referring to company or association. So a living person can transfer property amongst themselves. So a company can transfer the property to a living person and vice versa. So that is the meaning of living persons here. So the third aspect is the most important aspect as per me. One is living persons definitely there. Apart from that, the most important aspect is the transfer of immovable property. TPA primarily deals or only deals with immovable property. So if we are referring to any movable assets or movable property, it's not in the purview of TPA. So that is something which we need to keep in mind. The last point is the transfer of property from one living person to another can happen either in the present time, or it can be recorded, it can be planned in the future time as well. So technically, if you look at it, there are only four essentials which defines the TPA. One, between two living persons. Two, the living persons can also include the outer boundary. Also includes the let's say the legally created artificial person or legally created entities. The third is it refers only to the immovable property. The last one is it can happen, the transfer can happen present or it can happen in the future. This is all the TPA deals with. So this is the definition, these are the essentials. So as we saw the essentials of Transfer of Property Act in our previous slide, let's try to understand what is immovable property. So immovable property is not clearly defined, or it's not defined in TPA at all. So section 3 defines what is not immovable property. So that's the definition which gives us a clue as to what can be considered as immovable property. So now it's one straight line which it says all immovable property are those which does not include timber, growing crops or grass. So these are the three things which is not part of immovable property, rest all is. So now if at all we go a little deeper into understanding the definition here, so it states that anything that is rooted to earth, it is immovable property. One. Second, anything which is in the form of, let's say, walls, buildings, or let's say land, that is immovable property. Anything which which can be benefited out of by using that becomes immovable property. If these three or four conditions are satisfied, it becomes immovable property. Now the question arises saying that why is timber, growing crops and grass not immovable property even though they are rooted to earth? In one of the cases, Supreme Court did come up with a judgment which stated that timber, grass, or crops gets value only when they are severed from the earth. So that's why they are not considered as part of immovable property. So the definition is pretty simple and straightforward. Anything which cannot be moved from one place to another, which is connected to earth, is immovable property. So Section 3 talks about what is immovable property, or rather what is not immovable property, and indirectly defines immovable property definition. So this is section 3. Let's move on to the next slide. So in our previous slides, we spoke about what is TPA. Then we understood the essentials of TPA. Then we moved on to understand what is immovable property. Now it's time for us to understand who can do the transfer, or persons competent to do the transfer. Now the entire TPA revolves around transfer of immovable property between living persons, inter vivos, right? So now who are those living persons who can do the transfer? So Section 7 within the Act talks about the persons who are competent to do the transfer. So if at all I have to explain the entire definition in one simple line, any person who is competent to contract uh, can do the transfer. Now, it goes further in terms of talking about, let's say, whether wholly it is done or whether the part transfer is being done, and so on. So keep in mind, any person who is capable of entering a contract is capable of doing the transfer. So now the meaning, or rather the competency to contract, you can refer section 11 in Indian Contract Act. So what does it say? He should not be a minor. Okay, below 18 years of age, he is not competent to contract. Next is, he should be of sound mind. So he should not be insane, he should not have any kind of mental issues. Third point is, he should not be disqualified from contracting by any law. If these parameters are taken care, then means he is capable to enter into any contract. If he is capable to enter into contract, he is capable of doing a transfer of property as well. So this is where the definition of persons competent to transfer comes into picture. So our next topic is rule against perpetuity. So rule against perpetuity, this doctrine is very important in the unit. So what we will be doing is, before we understand the doctrine, let's dissect this particular set of words and understand what exactly perpetuity means. Perpetuity, in a very layman's language, it means continuous or forever or perpetual and so on. It's a dictionary meaning. Now this rule is explained in section 14 of TPA. So before we dwell into the definition part of it, let's try to understand the meaning of this particular rule through a couple of scenarios here. Let me take scenario here. So scenario one, so there is a grandfather or a person who has a son, and he wants to give his property to his grandson. So now, can he do it as per TPA? Is it possible? Because the grandson is unborn, he is not born yet. So now how does this operate? So as per TPA, what it states is, the property, any property, movable property, cannot be without a owner. So that's a simple straight sentence for that. So now if he wants to transfer it to his unborn grandson, can he do it in the name of unborn grandson? Which is not possible. So what does this rule against perpetuity says? It states that you transfer the property first to a living person. Post the living person's lifetime, it will get transferred to the unborn grandchild or whatever. And by then the child should have reached a majority age and so on. Then the property will get transferred. So the life interest gets created with the father or the son here, and the absolute interest is created post maturity or post majority in the unborn grandson. So now if he wants to transfer the property unborn grandson, how should he be doing? He should transfer it to his son. The son, after his lifetime and after the child achieves majority, the property gets transferred to the child. So the entire act of transferring to unborn child is possible through this way. Okay, so let's move on to scenario 2. Scenario 2, now the grandfather wants to give the property to his son. That means unborn grandson, great grandson of grandson. Okay, so or rather you can call him as great grandson, right? So is it possible? So in this scenario the TPA does not allow you to do that. What does it state? The transfer can be possible only through living persons. You go back to the essentials, it talks about living persons, whereby it states that you transfer the property to a living person. From there on, once he has a child, the child will get the property post the is majority or maturity age. So that's the rule which is there. So if he has to transfer to grandson, great grandson in this case, 2, it's not possible. He can transfer it to his son, and then he can transfer it to unborn grandson post the maturity age. He cannot be transferring to grandson number 2 or the great grandson in this scenario. So now what is the rule? So it says the rule is the lifetime of a living person. So in this case, we have seen the father or the son, the lifetime of that particular person, then plus the gestation period, which is very important. The gestation period allowed, which is rule against perpetuity, is 9 months. If the child is being born or is in the womb of the mother, the 9 months is the gestation period that is taken into consideration, plus the maturity age of the son who is going to be born. So this is the maximum period where you can hold a property to transfer it to somebody else. So lifetime, let's assume the lifetime of the father or the son is 60 years plus the gestation period, which is 9 months, plus 18. 60 plus 18 plus gestation period of 9 months, which is 78 plus 9 months. That is the maximum period the grandfather can hold the property to be given to the unborn grandson. So this is the rule against perpetuity. Now, why is this important? Why is this rule there? Why can't I transfer it to, let's say, sixth generation from me, or maybe 10th generation from me? The reason being, the court or the government or rather the law wants to make sure that the property is always exchanging hands. It is not stagnant. It is to be moving from one person to another person to enjoy the benefits. So make sure that property has retains its value and grows in value and so on. So that's why a rule against perpetuity is very, very important. Now the next question comes in: can I have more than one person in living persons, or other lifetime interest between, let's say, grandfather and the grandson? It is possible. Let's take one scenario here. Let's take illustration. The grandson wants to transfer it to grand unborn grandson, which is the scenario 1. Now there's a father, father's brother, brother's brother. So there are 3 people involved who are all living at this point of time. So grandfather can say the property will go to X, which is the son number 1, after that son number 2, after the son number 3, and then after the lifetime of these guys, it will go to my unborn grandson. So that is feasible, because as far as possible the property should always be in the control or under the control of a living person. So that is the rule against perpetuity. I hope you understood the rule. It is pretty simple, straightforward. So it cannot be transferred to unborn grandson without being transferred through a living person. It cannot go beyond one unborn grandson or unborn person. So that is the simple rule. I try to explain with scenario 1 and scenario 2. Hopefully that has kind of cleared your thoughts or understanding on rule against perpetuity. So let's move on to the next topic, which is vested and contingent interest. Vested interest is defined in section 19 in TPA, and contingent interest is defined in section 21. So let me give you illustrations to explain what is vested interest and what is contingent interest. Vested interest is pretty straightforward. So A sells his property to B, B purchases the property, and his vested interest is there from day 1 on in the property. or rather he gets the right on the property from day one. Let me take another illustration here. So A, who owns the property, says to B that after my death, the property belongs to you. So upon the death of A, the property moves, or rather B inherits the property from A. And the moment A told B about the inheritance of the property after his death, B gets vested interest in the property. So let me take one more illustration to explain. Let's take a scenario. There's X person who owns the property. There is Y person. A similar scenario whereby X says to Y, stating that my property is yours upon my death. Before the death of X person, Y dies in an accident. Now, how does the entire scheme of things work here? So, because it's a vested interest, the interest gets passed on to the legal heirs of Y. So, which is one good thing about vested interest part of it. So let's move on to in the same light. Let's move on to contingent interest. Contingent interest is something where the interest on the property develops upon occurrence of an event or completion of a particular act or event. Now, what is that? X states to Y, saying that if you marry my daughter, then this particular property belongs to you. So what is the contingent event here? Y has to marry the daughter of X. In case if he fails to marry the daughter of X, or if he ends up marrying somebody else, the property does not come to Y. If he marries daughter of X, then he will get the property. So the contingent event which needs to happen is the marriage. So the dependency of the ownership of the property, which Y is supposed to get, depends on the contingent act of the so-called marriage, right? So that is the basic difference between vested interest and contingent interest. In contingent interest, in case let's say the Y dies before before the occurrence of the event, in that case, like we saw in vested interest, it moves to the ownership moves to the legal heirs. It does not happen in contingent interest. So that is the basic difference between vested interest and contingent interest. So let's go to the next topic, which is rule of acceleration. Rule of acceleration is a very simple, straightforward doctrine. So it is discussed in section 27 in TPA. So what it states is, on failure of condition number 1, the condition number 2 gets activated. It's as simple as that. So let's take an illustration to discuss this or understand this concept. So let's say husband states that the property is being given to wife for her life, and once the wife expires during the lifetime of the husband, the property goes to person X. So let's assume a scenario whereby the wife dies during the lifetime of that husband. Then, as stated in the contract or the agreement, so the property moves to person X. So that is scenario number 1. So that is where we see a rule of acceleration coming into picture, where there's condition number 1, after condition number 1, there's condition number 2, which gets activated once the condition number 1 is either fails or it's fulfilled. It moves on to condition number 2. So now let's move on to a scenario which is pretty interesting. Let's complicate the scenario which we discussed right now a little further, whereby husband states that the property will go to wife till she is alive, and if she dies in the lifetime of the husband, the property goes to person X, which is what the scenario we saw. Now there was in this let's adding to the scenario here. So there was a situation where the husband and wife both died in an accident. Now, technically, so on death of the wife before the husband, the person X should get the property. But because it's accident, so it is not sure whether the wife died before the husband or vice versa, right? So the property here does not go to person X. So the condition 2 fails here. So these are the kind of scenarios which we can normally see at C for rule of acceleration. So just to simplify it again, if condition prior interest or prior condition fails, it moves on to execution of the second condition. So that is rule of acceleration, where you're accelerating from condition 1 to condition 2. So that is doctrine of rule of acceleration, or doctrine of acceleration, or rule of acceleration in section 27 of TPA. Let's move on to our next topic, which is the important case laws. I've noted down some case laws which is associated with some of the doctrines which we discussed right now in our presentation. Uh, so there are many more, case laws which can be written down or other noted for these doctrines. However, some of them are, let's say, for section 3, where we were referring to immovable property. We were talking, I mean, the case law which is very important is Shanthabai versus State of Bombay, and that's where the decision came into picture. What is immovable property as such? The definition for immovable property, right? So next is a rule against perpetuity. Tagore versus Tagore is one of very important cases, which happened somewhere in late 1800s, and that kind of gave a perspective in terms of rule against perpetuity and also transfer to unborn persons. So these are kind of connected, section 13 and section 14. So that is Tagore versus Tagore, or Bajrang Bahadur versus Bakhtraj Kuer, and Girjesh Dutt versus Datadin. So these cases are pretty important to talk about rule against perpetuity. So now that you understand the concept, the mention of these cases will definitely add more significance to the concept which you're trying to explain, and also it gives direction in terms of how courts have viewed these doctrines. Rule of acceleration, definitely you can look at Radha Prasad versus Rani, and also Ajudhia versus Rakhman Kaur. So these cases can also be associated with rule of acceleration. And some of the sections which associate, I mean, important sections in Unit 1, I will be talking in the next slide. So we'll move on to the last part of it, whereby some sections which I believe is important, for Unit 1 in TPA, which is Transfer of Property Act. So Section 3 definitely gives the foundation in terms of what is immovable property, or defines what is immovable property by giving highlights in terms of what is not considered as part of the immovable property definition. And Section 5 kind of gives the scope of TPA Act itself. So that is kind of important. Section 13 and 14 defines transfer for benefit of unborn persons, and also rule against perpetuity. So many laws, or many cases are decided around these doctrines. And rule of acceleration, section 27, is of very high importance in the unit. So these are some of the sections which I believe is to be focused on in Unit 1. And definitely there are more to it, but these are of primary importance. Thank you very much for watching AK Law Series TPA Unit 1 video. The whole idea of making this video is to give you some glance or some idea into the unit, so that it will help you in your preparation. Please don't just rely on these videos. Please do prepare by studying textbooks, and this will be more like a refresher for your exams with, let's say, KSLU or any other universities out there having similar syllabus. So I'll be coming out with more of such videos on other topics and other subjects, and I hope they will help you in your preparation for exams. Thank you very much. Have a nice time. This is Aditya from AK Law Series. Take care. Bye-bye.